Hello and welcome to our last class in the book of Acts. This is lesson 14, and today we're going to focus on chapter 28, which is Paul in Rome. Do hope this has been a useful, profitable study for you. A little bit different maybe than some other studies of Acts, but hopefully it's really helped you to think of the text in different ways. Maybe find some things in there that you haven't seen before. And also, of course, reinforce and build up some things that some great lessons that are there in the book. There's just a whole lot that's going on in these last few chapters. He's between his arrests and his travels and his getting to Rome. We want to talk mostly about his time in Rome in chapter 28 today, but thought it would be worthwhile to try and sketch an outline of what's going on in these chapters. I tried to put it in kind of a bulleted form. Hopefully it's helpful to you. You can download it from the notes section. You can see it on the screen as well. I don't know though. There's so much going on. It's hard to summarize it. I tried to condense it, but it didn't end up very condensed. But at any rate, hopefully that'll be useful for you. Let's start first with the questions. And as I have been doing, I put some questions in there for the Bible student, as I call them. Put in 7 this week. Encourage you to pick out a few just to talk about or to study in your class to discuss. The first being, we see again the Jews calling Christianity a sect. And if you look in verse 22 of chapter 28, you'll see that. And my question is, how are they describing this sect in positive terms, in negative terms? What do they have to say about it? And why would they characterize it that way? Paul quotes Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 in chapter 28, which you'll see there in speaking to the Jews in Rome. And interestingly, Jesus quoted the same passage. That's recorded in Matthew 13 and in Mark chapter 4. When he was explaining why he was teaching in parables, he quoted the same text. And so my question to you is, between the time Jesus quoted it in Matthew 13 and the time Paul's now quoting it, in both cases being quoted to some Jewish leaders, what's changed in the situation in those roughly 30 years now since these two statements? What are the parallels and what are the differences? How is it the same? How is it different? Third question, Paul says something very interesting there about Isaiah. He says Isaiah was the agent through whom the message was delivered, but who does Paul say actually was speaking? And what would we call that? And that again will be in Acts 28. Question about why Luke writes the way that he does. He gives so many details about the imprisonment, beginning in Jerusalem and then to Caesarea and then to Rome. So many details about the defenses that Paul gives, about the trip and all the places that they went and all the things that happened along the way. But when you get to the Roman portion of it, he just gives a 2-verse summary, the last 2 verses of the chapter. That's it. Very little attention. So my question to you is, why would Luke end the book this way? He appears to know the rest of the story. He was there, we think, from the way the text reads, but he talks about he dwelt 2 whole years there. So he seems to know what's going on. Why doesn't he include more? Why the abrupt end? That's the question. In 28:28, Paul is quoted there by Luke. My question to you is that, again, Luke foreshadowing? Is this Paul actually prophesying? Was his prophecy correct? What do you think of verse 28? Question number 6, way back in Acts 23:11, Jesus had appeared to Paul and promised him that he was going to bear witness for Christ in Rome also. And at that time, Paul was in Roman custody in Jerusalem. So I think it would behoove your group to take some time and discuss the unexpected way in which Jesus brought his promise about. And discuss how firm Paul's conviction was that this was going to happen. He was going to reach Rome, and he was going to be a witness for Christ there. And then, after you discuss those 2 things a little bit, talk about how that might strengthen our faith in our day and time. And then the last question there, something happened with Paul just before he gets to Rome. just before he gets there, in verse 15 of chapter 28, something happens that causes him to thank God and to take courage there. And my question to you is, given everything you've read about Paul up to now in the book and what's been happening, is it surprising to you that we read of Paul, taking courage or needing to take courage? And what does that say about the value of Christian fellowship for him in his day? And then what should it say about the value of Christian fellowship for us in our day? So discuss those questions and take a little time, pause the video if you'd like, and go through those. I think you'll get some good, that'll be the best part of your class. Okay, a very quick snapshot of where we are now, and I'll try not to drag this out too much because it's so easy to get lost in the details, but where are we? What's happened? Well, Paul is ending, you recall he ended the third missionary third missionary journey in Jerusalem, and he delivered the gifts that he had collected. But at that time, he's arrested, and so a 4+ year imprisonment begins at the hands of the Roman government. I'm going to guess it's between 4 and 5. The text talks about 2 years in Caesarea and 2 years in Rome. He had to travel to Rome. I'm just going to guess it was between 4 and 5 years of imprisonment there. That's what starts and carries all the way through then to the end of the book. And so he's in Jerusalem, and then Caesarea, and then Rome. So I'll just try and give you a short outline of what goes on in each of those places. In Jerusalem, you'll recall he returns, he delivers the gifts, and he meets the church there, and he's welcomed there. But he is encouraged by the leaders in the Jerusalem congregation to go to the temple and to submit to a ceremonial ritual of cleansing. This is apparently custom that a Jew would do. If they'd been out traveling in Gentile lands, they'd go through a purification ritual, and he's encouraged to do that to sort of make peace with the Jews there in Jerusalem. And so he does. And he takes 4 men with him. But the text says Jews from Asia saw him there, and they made false claims about him, the chief claim being that he'd brought a Gentile into the temple, which was, as a capital offense for them. That didn't happen, and so the Gentile would be killed, and so would Paul in all likelihood. That's what they accused him of. He didn't. He brought Jews in, but they made an assumption, or it was just a lie. I can't quite tell which. And so a mob begins. A mob forms, and there's a riot, and so the Roman soldiers hear this. They come rushing down to the temple courts. By now they're outside the temple. When they thought they brought a Gentile in, there's an uproar, and they throw everybody out, and they shut the door to the temple. And so they're out in the outer courts. So the Romans rush in, and they take Paul. And as they're leading him away, Paul asks to address the mob, and he does. That's the first address that we find. He's kept in custody overnight. The next day, he meets the whole Sanhedrin. That's the second address we see, but again that basically devolves down into a riot. Paul's still kept in custody, and in the meantime then a plot to kill him becomes known by his nephew, who tells the Roman guards who are watching him, and so they decide to send him to Caesarea. That's enough, they're going to get him out of Jerusalem. Not sure if Paul ever gets back to Jerusalem after this. This might be the last time he's there. It's hard to say. And so with that, he moves up to Caesarea. He'll be there for 2 years. And while he's imprisoned there, he has some freedoms. His friends are allowed to come and to visit him and to provide for his needs. And so presume that he's able to eat reasonably well and some of those kind of things, as could be much worse, I guess. And it may be that he writes some letters from there. There's 4 New Testament letters that are typically called the prison letters: Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. And we think people have concluded that they were written during this imprisonment, whether it was in the 2 years in Caesarea or the 2 years in Rome or some of each. No, you can't quite tell. But he may have written 1 or more of those letters in Caesarea. At any rate, when he's there, he appears before Felix, and his Jewish accusers come up, and that's the first address in Caesarea. Then there's a second appearance before Felix, and there are no Jewish accusers present. And then the text alludes to multiple appearances after that to Felix, because Felix is hoping for a bribe. But after about 2 years, Felix is succeeded by a guy by the name of Festus, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, just leaves Paul in prison. Then we get Paul's first appearance before Festus, and again, there's Jewish accusers that come up, and then we, Festus just seems to be sort of confused by the whole thing, and he suggests Paul goes back to Jerusalem to face his accusers there and to get this thing settled, and Paul says, no way, I'm not going back there. He refuses, and he appeals to Caesar instead, which was his Roman, which was the right he had as a Roman citizen. And so Felix says, off you go then to Caesar. That's fine with him, gets him out of his hair. In the meantime, while he's waiting to go to Rome, King Agrippa and his wife Bernice come by, and so Festus has Paul appear before them, and that's another address. And so we've already had about 6 addresses of Paul in prison, a lot of which we have summaries of in the book. And then after about 2 years then, up in Caesarea, he's sent to Rome. You can read about his journey there. There's a lot in there. There's storms, there's shipwrecks, there's vipers, there's all kinds of things going on. Wayne Jackson makes a comment, this is the most remarkable account of ancient sea navigation in the annals of history. He means ancient history, obviously. Just a fascinating trip there. When he gets to Rome, again, he has some degree of freedom. His friends are able to come and provide for his needs, and they do. And the 4 prison epistles, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, they're sometime between Caesarea and here, they're completed and written. And Philemon, at least, you could be fairly certain was written in Rome. It alludes to events that occurred in Rome. Philippians, the way I read it, probably occurred in Rome, but it's really not super clear, I guess. At any rate, he meets with the Jews in Rome, Jewish leaders in Rome from the local synagogues, and he wants to do that, and he immediately wants to know if they received word about him from the Jews in Jerusalem. And they had not. They had not sent letters. Nothing had occurred. And so Paul reasons with them, tries to demonstrate from the scriptures who Jesus Christ is, and that he is God's anointed one, and about the death, burial, and resurrection, and life that's found in his name. And some are converted. It's a very, seems to be a very tepid response, as he got in most places where he preached to the Jews. But some believe, but many do not, and they dispute among themselves. And that's when Paul will quote Isaiah, and he says, look, it's right, the gospel goes to you first, but now I'm turning to the Gentiles, and let it be known to you Jews that they are going to hear it. And with that, the book ends. With Paul in a Roman prison there. We know that he was eventually released. You can read in the book of Philippians that he anticipates his release soon. And from the letters of 1 Timothy and Titus and the chronology that you can piece together, people are confident that he was released. Eventually, though, he will be put back in a Roman prison, and this time there won't be a release for him in this life. He'll be martyred there. There is a link that I've got on your sheet to an article in the Christian Courier that has a lot of interesting information about that aspect, that portion of Paul's life, including the places and the people, lots of people that were involved, and I'll leave that for you to study. Okay, one more quick thing for you here before we get to our lesson. I did have up something that I think you might find interesting, just by way of an outlining what's been going on in Paul's life. Here's a timeline that kind of relates the journeys and the letters that he wrote. And David, I believe, is going to lead us, Dave Ingram's going to lead us through a class on the letters. And I just thought I'd put this up. This is from Nelson's Book of Maps and Charts. And you can just kind of see when the things are happening. You've got his first missionary journey, and you can see there's some question marks. All these dates basically have question marks, but some of them are more questionable than others. You can see Galatians, there's an early and a late. There's different theories there, but you get the general idea. His first journey is the council, the second journey, the third, his trials there with the Jews and the Romans, and then his Roman imprisonment, and then what they call the fourth missionary journey. A lot of people call his journey to Rome for his imprisonment his fourth missionary journey, but whatever. Some people call that then the fifth after he gets out of that first Roman imprisonment, and then his second one. And as far as people can ascertain, he died in about, or was martyred in about 68, maybe 67 A.D. And of course, a couple of years after that, then Jerusalem's destroyed and the temple's destroyed. And you can see on that second journey, as he stops there in Corinth, he writes his letters back to the Thessalonians. On his third journey, he's in a couple of places there writing letters, the Corinthian letters especially. And if you recall, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 talks about that collection, and that he wanted the Corinthians to take up, that he would come by and take it back to Jerusalem, and that's of course what he did, and that's when he was arrested. And then in his first Roman imprisonment, you can see the 4 prison letters there: Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And not sure which ones, some of those could have been written in Caesarea during that 2-year period, but pretty sure Philippians and Philemon probably were written in Rome. But at any rate, then there he got out. He went on a couple letters there, what are called pastoral letters to Timothy and Titus. And then, of course, we know when he wrote 2 Timothy, he is expecting his death. He's in prison again, and this time he doesn't expect to be let out. If you read Philippians chapter 1 from his first Roman imprisonment, you'll see he anticipates being released. When you read 2 Timothy, he does not. He expects to be executed there, and that is what occurred. And so we think Paul was born about AD 5, and so converted, very early on, a couple, 3 years into the preaching of the gospel, somewhere in there. So he was converted when he was maybe 28 to 32, somewhere in that range. And then he had a ministry of about 30 years of preaching and teaching the gospel. And when you go through Acts, it goes so fast, you don't realize what else is going on. But you can see he's already writing these letters, and these letters are already coming out, and so much of them are already done. And you can see the ones that are finishing there. So you might get, these timelines do vary, but I just thought that might give you a little bit of a thought about what's going on here, and so I thought I'd put that in there. All right, and let's talk then about his message to the Jews in Rome, and what's actually in the chapter. Before we get to that, in the first heading there in the outline, that is a blessing of fellowship. And if you read there in verse 15, let's just start in verse 11. After 3 months we sailed in an Alexandrian ship whose figurehead was the twin brothers, which had wintered at the island. And landing at Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. And from there we circled round and reached Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were invited to stay with them 7 days. And so we went toward Rome. From there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as the AP Forum and 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Just consider what's going on in his life. This long, arduous journey. He's 2 to 3 years into this imprisonment. Very difficult journey, and he's on his way, and he's in Rome, and he's basically almost to the city, and some brethren come out. He's not met these brethren before, in all likelihood. These are the people that he wrote. Some of these people he probably are the ones he wrote the book of Romans to, and he knows them from reputation and by sending him that letter. When you get to the tail end of Romans, you see he knows quite a few people, so perhaps he knew some of them, but perhaps some of them he doesn't even know. And they come out to meet him, and they walk along with him as he makes his way there, the final leg of his journey. And for Paul, this causes thanksgiving, and it causes him to take courage. And I think it says a lot about the value of fellowship for Paul. He's in his late 60s here. He's in his late 50s here, probably. About a little older than me. I'll be 55 soon. He's probably 58, 59, something like that. This is happening, and it's so valuable to him going into this trial that he's going to face. Here these brethren come, and it causes him to take courage. And if you think of Paul as taking courage, that tells you how much fellowship meant to him, their care for him, and their willingness to come and to be identified with him, a prisoner, and I'm sure to help provide for his needs, just meant so much to him, so that he didn't feel alone and isolated and lonely and deserted. And that should tell us something about the power of fellowship in our lives. We're not in that kind of situation, obviously, nothing like that. But probably if they're, if I were to ask you or take a poll in the congregation, some of the more neglected things, some of the areas, that are neglected in modern Christian society in the United States, as we've known it for the last, 10 to 40 years, probably this would be one of the things that would be highlighted is the lack of close fellowship that exists. And that's probably something we really could work on. You can just see here the power of it. You can also see the power of it when you read the letters, especially if you read the letter of Philippians and Philemon. You can really see how that fellowship helped him during these imprisonments. And so that I think is something for us to think about, and maybe you thought about that as one of your questions. The second thing then, if you drop down to verse 20, it's interesting what he says. For this reason, so he calls the Jews together and he wants to speak to them. The Jews there in Rome, they haven't heard anything about him. They didn't get any bad letters, ratting him out before he got there, anything like that. And so he's talking about how he got in this mess. And he said, verse 19, when the Jews spoke against it, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, not that I had anything of which to accuse my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have called to you to see and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. And this has been a consistent message going all the way back to chapter 2, when Peter first starts to preach the gospel, that I've tried to point out as we made our way through, that what you're seeing with the kingdom of God in the church coming to fruition is not some kind of replacement or some kind of failure of Israel. This is the fulfillment of what it is that God promised Israel. And Paul says it's for that hope that our Father gave Israel that I'm here for you right now. That's why I've got this chain that I'm wearing around me. And he goes on to declare to them these things. And you can see in the text there how he does that. But I just... that to me is such an important point and shouldn't be lost. The church is not a replacement or some kind of plan B. The church is what God has been promising. It's fulfillment of what he said he would do for Israel. They now have their king. You remember when they came out of Egypt, God said, I'll be your king. You don't need a king. But that wasn't good enough for them. And now you see God is once again their king in the kingdom. And the bringing in of the Gentiles is not to replace the Jews. It is the filling of the world with the will and the love of God. And so you just see that all the way through. You've seen Paul say that in several of his defenses. He says it here, talking to these Jews. Such an important point, I think, there for us. And then down in verse 23, just something to note. When they had appointed him a day, many came to him at his lodging, to whom he explained and solemnly testified of the kingdom of God, persuading them concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets, from morning until evening. And it just builds that idea that Peter and Paul, both in their sermons that we have, when they're speaking to Jews, they go back to the old law and they show that everything that you're seeing is a fulfillment of what God promised, and that Jesus is the Christ, and they demonstrate that from those scriptures. The law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, so many things in what we term the Old Testament that foreshadow and foretell and explain and promise the coming of the Anointed One. And Paul goes back to those messages to establish that Jesus is the Christ. Apollos did the same thing. There was a note to him doing it. We saw Peter do it. We see them doing it. This was the message to the Jews in these sermons. And I don't think that should be lost on us. We don't have... I guess I'm not being very clear. What I'm trying to say is that you and I, when we look at the Old Testament, this is fundamentally how we should look at it. Paul said in Romans, it was written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And that hope comes, I think, from our Father demonstrating his ability to keep his will no matter what men do. His ability to, I shouldn't say keep, but to carry out his will no matter what men do. He said he was bringing the Messiah, and just all throughout that Old Testament history, he sprinkles clues and sprinkles clues, and finally one comes who fulfills all of those things, and there's not going to be another one. it's too late. It's too late for somebody else to rise up. They won't be able to fulfill all those things that are written in the Old Testament about him. And this is how, one of the primary ways to look at the Old Testament is that they testify of the kingdom of God that God said was coming, and of his king, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. One of the most important, one of the most important lenses, as Thomas would say, of looking at the Old Testament. What is God doing back there? A lot of other things we can learn from it for sure, but that's certainly one of the primary ideas there that are in it. All right, now just a couple other thoughts I'll throw in here. I think if you would go read some of the letters, you would get an idea of Paul's attitude during these imprisonments. Probably if you don't have time to read them all, especially read Philippians chapter 1. If you don't have any time to do anything else, read Philippians chapter 1. I'm just going to read to you some of the things he said during these prison letters, so you can catch his attitude as this is all going on in his life. Philippians chapter 1, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live, is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on the flesh, this will mean fruit for my labor. Yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you, and being confident of this, I know I shall remain and continue with you all for the progress and joy of your faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel, so that, whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in the Spirit, with one mind striving together for the faith of the gospel. Do all things without complaining and disputing. He's somewhere between 3 and 5 years into a completely unjust imprisonment, and in a letter he writes, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights of the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Yes, and if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I'm glad and I rejoice with you all, and for this reason you also be glad and rejoice with me. Think about what he's saying there. 3 years in to an unjust imprisonment, do all things without complaining and disputing, and you, Philippians, you hold fast to that word of truth, because I didn't do all this for nothing. I don't want to have labored in vain in terms of your souls. You get a hold of that word, and you hang on to it, and you don't let it go. And yes, my life may be poured out right here as a drink offering, but if it does, that's all right. I'm going to rejoice with you. You rejoice too. You hang on until the Lord comes again. Colossians chapter 4, continue earnestly in prayer, be vigilant in it with thanksgiving, meanwhile praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word, to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. There he is in chains, and he wants them to pray for him, that he'll have both an opportunity and the will to make Christ known. Ephesians chapter 6, be praying always, with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end, and with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. As for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in it I may speak boldly, as I ought to speak. And then in Philemon, verse 8, therefore, though I could be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you, being such a one as Paul, the aged, and now a prisoner of Jesus Christ. You see the language he uses there? Such a one as Paul, the aged, late 50s, maybe 60, and now a prisoner of Jesus Christ. So I put some passages there in your outline, and if you have some time, you might read those and consider his attitude there. And the next point there, I just mentioned to you, I think I just did, he was about 30 when he was converted, so he's had about 30 years of ministry, and as we're reading about in Acts chapter 28, he's maybe somewhere between 58 and 60, and he's only got maybe 8 to 10 years left on this earth when the book ends. Last thing I'll mention to you, 2 more things, I guess. But I just put it on your outline there. I think you should take note of how the gospel is presented throughout Acts, and two words in at least the translation that I use most often, the New King James, two words come up over and over and over again in there, and that is reasoning and persuading. And I gave you a whole bunch of verses there. I don't expect you to read them all necessarily, but I gave you a catalog because I want you to see the way the gospel was taught. Nobody appealed to any kind of secular authority. Nobody there was no manipulation. There was no, this is the way the gospel, it was reasoning and persuading. When Peter writes there in 1 Peter about always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that's in you with gentleness, this is the idea behind it. This is how they carried the gospel, and it's how we ought to carry the gospel. We're not out belittling people. We're not out attacking people. I don't have to tell you that in the history of all religions, and certainly in the history of Christianity, there have been other methods of expounding the gospel. Once the Roman Emperor Constantine gets involved, things changed rapidly. With the way it was advanced, it became the state religion. And these things were not good. It's not good to think of America as Christianity being a state religion. We're probably past that now, but maybe 20 years ago we would talk about that more. But this is how the gospel was given. He reasoned and he persuaded. That's how we are to give the gospel, reasoning and persuading. Last comment then I'll make is this. We have seen this tour through the book of Acts. We started out with 11 apostles. One was added to make 12. In the middle of the book, the apostle Paul is added to make 13 active apostles. We saw the death of James. We've seen imprisonments. We've seen beatings. We've seen shipwrecks. We've seen stonings. No end of things that they suffered. I started out, I think, in my first lesson talking about these being the greatest men the world has ever known. Because of what they did. Jesus gave them a task. You're going to be my witnesses. You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And he could have just as well have said to the end of time, because you and I still go to the book the Holy Spirit prepared for us, and we're seeing the witness of these men in the pages of these scriptures. And it's when you think about the absolute incredible impact that Jesus Christ has had on the world, we should also remember the impact that these 12 plus the Apostle Paul had on the world as well. They fulfilled their ministry, and they would never have guessed, I don't think, I guess I don't know, I don't think they would ever have guessed that 2,000 years later, on the other side of the world, in a society they would know nothing about and would not recognize, that you and I would be reading their words and instilling in ourselves the hope of heaven, instilling in ourselves a love for one another, and learning what it means to be a disciple of Christ. I can't imagine they had any idea of the reach, what God was going to do through them. And God did do it simply because they were faithful. And you and I ought to take a note of that. We're not his witnesses to the ends of the earth, but we have our mission and our ministry to perform, and there's just no telling what God can do through you and through me when we'll humble ourselves, surrender our lives, and serve him as best we can. I hope the book of Acts, you've seen that. You've seen the adventure that serving Christ can be. Hope to see you again soon. May God richly bless you in the meantime. I'll talk to you soon.